The morning after Clara Monroe vanished, the storm still raged over Harrow's Point, its furious winds tearing at the roofs of old, salt-streaked houses and driving icy sheets of rain against cracked, weathered windows. The narrow streets were empty, the fog rolling in thick and heavy, muffling the echoes of crashing waves and the creaking of forgotten ships in the harbor. It was as if the entire town held its breath, waiting for a secret too terrible to speak. But against all odds, Clara Monroe had survived. She awoke to the sharp, metallic taste of blood in her mouth, her head pounding like a war drum, her body aching as if she had been dragged through the jagged rocks of the coastline. She found herself lying on a cold, damp floor, the rough stone beneath her hands wet and slick with seawater. The air around her was thick and heavy, filled with the pungent, briny stench of saltwater and rotting seaweed. She tried to move, her stiff muscles protesting with each slight shift, her mind struggling to grasp what had happened. Slowly, the memories returned, the whispers, the shadows, the figure in the darkness. She remembered the flashlight flickering, the cold breath against her neck, the rasping voice that whispered a single, terrible word, Eclipse. For a moment, panic surged through her veins, her heart racing as she forced herself upright, her trembling fingers groping for her battered leather satchel. It lay beside her, damp and covered in a thin layer of salt, but intact. She clutched it to her chest, the familiar weight of her notebook and recorder a small comfort in the oppressive darkness. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she realized she was no longer in the old Yates house. She was in a small, crumbling chamber, its stone walls slick with seawater, the air thick with the sound of dripping water and the distant, echoing crash of waves against stone. Long, twisted roots dangled from the ceiling above her, their gnarled tendrils reaching down like grasping fingers, the faint, salty mist clinging to their twisted, rope-like forms. Clara forced herself to her feet, her boots slipping on the wet, uneven stone as she staggered toward the faint, pale light that flickered at the far end of the chamber. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps as she stumbled forward, her free hand brushing against the cold, slick walls as she moved. The narrow passageway opened into a larger, slightly drier chamber, its walls lined with strange, spiraling symbols that seemed to pulse in the dim, greenish light. She hesitated, her pulse thundering in her ears, the shadows around her seeming to stretch and twist like living things as she stepped into the center of the room. There, on a small, makeshift altar of rough, sea-worn stones, sat her flashlight, its cracked, mud-streaked lens flickering weakly in the darkness. She stumbled toward it, her shaking fingers reaching for the familiar, battered grip. As her hand closed around the cold, metal handle, the light flickered and brightened, casting sharp, angular shadows against the slick, algae-covered walls. A sudden, sharp sound echoed through the chamber, the slow, deliberate scrape of wet, heavy footsteps against the rough stone. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she spun around, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness to reveal the mysterious figure, mid-40s, long, flowing hair, a wide-brimmed hat casting deep shadows over a clenched jaw, and a long, water-soaked coat dripping onto the stone floor. Clara stumbled back, her pulse thundering in her ears as the figure took another slow, deliberate step forward, the edges of its coat trailing across the wet, uneven stones, each drop echoing like a heartbeat in the darkness. The air grew colder, the shadows pressing in around her as the figure tilted its head, as if listening for something hidden in the darkness. "Eclipse," it whispered, its voice like the wind cutting through the icy surf. Clara's terror turned to fury. She gripped the flashlight tighter, her knuckles white as she backed away, her boots slipping on the slick stone floor. She could feel the cold, damp air tightening around her, the shadows stretching toward her like the grasping fingers of forgotten whispers. "No," Clara whispered, her voice trembling but fierce. "Not this time." With a surge of desperate courage, she swung the flashlight at the figure, the beam cutting through the darkness like a blade, its harsh, trembling light catching on the sharp edges of the spiraling symbols carved into the stone walls. The shadows around them twisted and writhed, the air growing colder, the whispers rising to a deafening chorus as the figure stumbled back, its long, dripping coat flaring out behind it like the wings of a dark, spectral bird. The figure paused, its head tilting once more as if in pain, its long, flowing hair whipping around its shadowed face as the whispers grew louder, their voices clashing and overlapping like the crash of violent waves. "You're not real," Clara shouted, her voice echoing off the slick, algae-covered walls. "You're just a ghost. A shadow. You have no power over me." The figure hesitated, its shadow stretching and twisting like smoke as the flashlight beam flickered and brightened, the symbols on the walls glowing with a faint, unnatural light. The figure staggered back, its coat trailing across the wet stone, its head tilting once more as if listening to a distant, fading echo. With a final, desperate burst of strength, Clara lunged forward, her flashlight beam slashing through the darkness as she charged at the figure, the light catching it full in the chest. The figure stumbled back, its long, dark coat flaring out around it as it collapsed against the rough stone wall, its shadow shrinking and writhing as the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. And then, silence. Clara gasped for breath, her pulse thundering in her ears as she stumbled back, her flashlight beam flickering weakly as the figure crumpled to the ground, its long, water-soaked coat collapsing into a dark, shapeless mass on the cold, wet stone. Without looking back, Clara turned and staggered down the narrow passage, her boots splashing through the shallow pools of icy seawater as she forced open the rusted metal door at the far end of the chamber. Cold, blinding light flooded the tunnel, the salt-laden wind whipping against her face as she stumbled out onto a narrow, windswept ledge high above the crashing waves of the North Atlantic. For a moment, she stood frozen, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened, her pulse thundering in her ears as the wind howled around her. Then, with a final desperate burst of strength, she stumbled down the narrow, crumbling path that led away from the cliffs, her boots slipping on the wet, moss-covered rocks as she fought to keep her balance. But for now, she was alive. And that, for Clara Monroe, was enough. Question: well, do you also think the help might came from her dead mother? 'Cause that no ordinary. Let me know in the comments section. Thanks for watching till the end.